In the middle of a charity event in Oakland, Shaquille O'Neal asked for the microphone and made a public confession about Steph Curry that nobody expected. The Giant's words shocked Curry so much that he became visibly emotional in front of hundreds of people. What Shaq revealed in that moment completely transformed the relationship between two of the NBA's greatest legends and left the entire arena in tears. The October sun was beginning to set over the San Francisco Bay, painting the Oakland sky with orange tones that reflected in the mirrored windows of Oracle Arena. It was a typical Tuesday in California, a mild temperature of 72 degrees, a gentle breeze coming from the ocean, carrying the salty aroma that always embraced the region. But inside the arena, nothing was typical that night. The Heroes on Court event brought together some of the NBA's greatest legends for a cause that touched the hearts of everyone present, raising funds for war veterans in vulnerable situations. The stands, normally roaring with thousands of fans, now accommodated around 500 people. Veterans, their families, children from the local Oakland community, and some lucky ones who had secured their tickets through donations. Backstage, the movement was intense but controlled. Arena staff adjusted final lighting details while the ambient sound tested the microphones. The characteristic smell of a basketball arena, a mixture of waxed wood, old sweat, and industrial cleaning, hung in the air, bringing instant memories to anyone who had ever stepped on a court. Shaquille O'Neal stood near the entrance to the locker rooms, his enormous hands holding a coffee cup that seemed tiny between his fingers. At 51 years old, Shaq still impressed with his 7 feet 1 inch height and shoulders that seemed to occupy half the corridor. He wore an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, a necessity when you have the physique of a giant, and his eyes surveyed the EID environment with the tranquility of someone who had lived through thousands of nights like that one. But there was something different in his gaze that night, a subtle restlessness that contrasted with his habitually relaxed posture. On the other side of the corridor, Steph Curry was animatedly conversing with a group of children who had arrived from a community center in East Oakland at 35 years old. Curry maintained that youthful energy that had characterized him since his first days in the NBA. He wore a simple white polo shirt and dark jeans. Nothing flashy, but each piece chosen with the care of someone who knew that every public appearance would be photographed. "Man, can you really make shots from anywhere on the court?" asked a boy of about 12 years old, his eyes shining with genuine admiration. Curry smiled. That smile that had won fans around the world. "The truth is, I miss much more than you see on TV," he responded, crouching down to the boy's height. "What you don't see are the thousands of hours I spend training every day. The success you see on the court is just the tip of the iceberg." A girl of about 10 years old, wearing a faded Warriors t-shirt, timidly raised her hand. "My grandma says you put Oakland on the world map. Is that true?" The question made Curry pause for a moment, his eyes reflecting something deeper. Oakland had always been more than a city to him. It was home. It was identity. It was the place where he had built not just a career, but a legacy that transcended basketball. "Oakland was already on the map long before me," he said softly. "This city has a strength, a soul that is unique. I was just lucky to be part of its history." 20 meters away, Shaq observed the scene in silence. There was something about Curry's naturalness with the children that fascinated him, and at the same time bothered him in a way he couldn't completely explain. During his glory years with the Lakers, he also did community work, charity appearances, but always felt like he was playing a role, the role of the generous and accessible big man. With Curry, everything seemed genuine, effortless, as if he wasn't trying to be anything other than what he really was. Marcus Thompson, a veteran reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle who had covered the NBA for more than 20 years, approached Shaq with the care of someone who knows the unpredictable temperament of superstars. "Shaq, it'll be cool to have you and Curry at the same event. Have you had a chance to talk personally?" The question was simple, but carried the weight of years of public comments. Shaq had been vocal in his criticism of the modern NBA style of play, frequently mentioning how the excessive focus on three-point shots was destroying the beauty of the traditional game. Curry had involuntarily become the symbol of this revolution that Shaq criticized. "We've bumped into each other a few times at league events," Shaq responded, his voice carrying that diplomatic tone he used when he wanted to avoid controversies. "He's a good kid, talented." But Marcus noticed something in Shaq's hesitation, an almost imperceptible pause before completing the sentence. It was as if there were more words wanting to come out, but finding an internal barrier. On the other side of the corridor, Curry was finishing his conversation with the children when his personal assistant, Kevin, approached discreetly. "Steph, you have about 15 minutes before the event starts. Want to rest a bit in the locker room?" Curry nodded, but his eyes involuntarily directed toward where Shaq was standing. For a brief moment, the gazes of both crossed through the busy corridor. There were no waves, forced smiles, or gestures of recognition. Just a moment of eye contact that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but carried the weight of years of undeclared tension. While walking toward the locker room, Curry couldn't get out of his mind the words that Shaq had said months ago on a podcast. "Today's basketball lost its masculinity. Everyone wants to be pretty shooting from far away instead of going inside and fighting." The words had hurt more than Curry would ever admit publicly, not because of the criticism of his playing style. He had already proven his worth by winning 4 NBA titles. It hurt because it came from someone he secretly admired since childhood. Someone whose physical presence and dominance had redefined what it meant to be a center in the NBA. The corridor leading to the locker rooms was quieter, away from the event's buzz. The walls were decorated with historical photos of the Warriors, from the days when they played in San Francisco to the recent golden era in Oakland. Curry stopped in front of a photo from 2015, his first NBA title. Remembering the feeling of finally proving that a small kid from Davidson College could conquer the world. Behind him, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. Curry didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Few men in the world made the floor vibrate that way when walking. Curry. The deep, resonant voice of Shaquille O'Neal made Curry slowly turn around. They stood alone in the corridor. No cameras, no entourage. Just the two of them, stripped of the public personas they'd carefully crafted over the years. "Shaq," Curry replied, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "How are you?" Shaq paused, as if searching for the right words. His usually assured gaze held a mix of determination and something else, something Curry couldn't quite place. He took a breath. "Curry," he said, "there's something I need to say. And I think I need to say it in front of everyone. Today." The gravity in Shaq's voice made Curry stop in his tracks. He looked him straight in the eyes. There was a quiet intensity there, a decision that had clearly been made, long ago. "Are you sure?" Curry asked, sensing the weight behind Shaq's words. Shaq's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "I've held it in for too long," he admitted. "It's time. Time to tell the truth. All of it." Both men understood. Once they stepped back into that room, there would be no turning back. Whatever Shaq was about to reveal would change everything, publicly and permanently. Their return to the main gym of Oracle Arena couldn't have been timed better. Ahmad Rashad had just called on the legends in attendance to share stories meant to inspire. Magic Johnson had wrapped up an emotional speech about overcoming adversity. The room was electric with emotion and anticipation. Then, as Shaq and Curry appeared at the gymnasium entrance, a low ripple spread through the crowd. Recognition, curiosity, and something just short of awe. The 500 people present, war veterans, their families, children from the Oakland community, and special guests turned to observe the arrival of the two superstars. Ahmad, perceiving the opportunity, smiled broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have here two legends who represent different eras of our beloved basketball, Shaquille O'Neal and Steph Curry." The applause was warm and respectful. Shaq waved to the crowd. But there was something different in his posture, a tension, a seriousness that contrasted with his habitually relaxed personality. "Ahmad," Shaq said, walking determinedly toward the center of the court, "can I have the microphone for a moment?" The question surprised not only Ahmad, but everyone present. Shaq rarely asked to speak first at events like that, preferring to let others break the ice. "Of course, Shaq, the court is yours." The microphone was handed over, and Shaq stood in the center of Oracle Arena's court, the same place where he had faced the Warriors countless times during his career, where he had lived epic battles, memorable victories, and defeats. "Good evening, everyone," Shaq began, his voice echoing clearly through the sound system before anything else. "I want you to know that what I'm going to say now, well, I've never said this publicly before." The silence in the gymnasium became absolute. Even the children, naturally restless, seemed to feel the gravity of the moment. Curry, still on the sideline of the court, felt his heart accelerate, not knowing exactly what to expect. "Throughout my entire career, I was always known as the big guy, the dominator," Shaq continued, walking slowly across the court. "I used my size as a weapon, as an advantage that nobody could match, and for years, I thought that was the only correct way to play basketball." He stopped and looked directly at Curry, who remained motionless on the sideline. "When Steph Curry began to revolutionize this game that we all love, I resisted. I criticized. I said basketball was losing its essence, its masculinity." Murmurs began to sweep through the audience. Journalists present pulled out their cell phones and notepads, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "But today," Shaq said, his voice beginning to tremble slightly, "I want to admit something that has been tormenting me for years." The pause that followed seemed to last an eternity. The only audible sound was the almost imperceptible hum of the arena's ventilation system. I was wrong, completely, devastatingly wrong. The words fell over the audience like an emotional bomb. Shaq, one of the most confident and dominant personalities in sports history, was publicly admitting error and vulnerability. "More than that," he continued, now with visible tears beginning to form in his eyes, "I was criticizing Steph not because he was destroying basketball, but because he was showing me that there's a form of greatness that I never managed to achieve." Curry felt his legs go weak. Never in his most impossible dreams had he imagined hearing these words from Shaquille O'Neal. "You want to know the truth?" Shaq asked. Now looking directly at the children in the front row, I watched all of Steph's games in hiding, alone at home. After everyone went to sleep, I would stay awake, studying how he played. A sepulchral silence dominated the arena. Even the photographers stopped clicking, as if any sound could break the magic of that moment. "And do you know why?" Shaq asked, now walking toward Curry. "Because he had achieved something that I, with all my physical strength, never managed. Transcending limitations, he took the cards that life dealt him, a body that many considered inadequate for the NBA, and transformed those limitations into superpowers." Tears now flowed freely down Shaq's face, but his voice remained firm and clear. "Steph," he said, extending his hand toward Curry, inviting him to join him at center court. "Come here, man." Curry walked slowly toward the center of the court, each step loaded with emotion. When he got close to Shaq, he could see not just the tears, but a human vulnerability that completely contrasted with the giant's public image. "I owe you an apology," Shaq said, now speaking both to Curry and to the audience, "for all the criticism, for all the resistance, for not having the humility to recognize your greatness when it was right in front of me." Curry felt a lump forming in his throat. The man who had been his childhood idol, who had represented everything he thought he could never be, was apologizing publicly. "But more important than the apology," Shaq continued, "is the recognition. Steph Curry didn't destroy traditional basketball. He evolved. He took everything our generation built and found ways to make the game more beautiful, more inclusive, more inspiring." The impact of the words was visible on all the faces present. NBA veterans in the stands exchanged looks of surprise and emotion. The children stared fixedly, absorbing every word as if they were life lessons. "And do you know what my biggest lesson was?" Shaq asked, now placing a hand on Curry's shoulder. "That greatness doesn't come in a single form. For years, I thought that to be great, you had to be physically dominant like me. But Steph taught me that there are many ways to dominate." Curry finally found his voice. "Shaq, let me finish," Shaq said gently. "Because this needs to be said." He turned completely to face Curry, the two legends now face to face at center court, with hundreds of people witnessing one of the most honest moments in recent NBA history. "You dominate through precision, through consistency, through the ability to make others believe that the impossible is possible. You transformed skinny kids around the world into dreamers because they look at you and think, if he did it, I can do it too." The words resonated through the arena like a universal declaration. Parents present looked at their children, seeing in the children's eyes a new understanding about possibilities and dreams. "And that," Shaq said, his voice now broken by emotion, "that is a form of greatness that I never managed to achieve. I could dominate physically, but you dominate spiritually. You make people believe in themselves." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Tears welled up in Curry's eyes as he finally spoke. "Shaq, all I ever wanted was the respect of legends like you. Every time you criticized me, it cut deep, because you represent an era I grew up idolizing." His words hit home, not just with the crowd, but with Shaq himself. For the first time, Shaq truly understood the weight of his comments, the legacy they carried, and the pain they could cause. "Man," Shaq murmured. Without thinking, he pulled Curry into a hug. "You've always had my respect. I was just too proud to admit that the game had evolved beyond what I knew. The embrace, between two giants, one of size and one of symbolism, sparked a thunderous ovation that shook Oracle Arena. Applause echoed like a wave crashing across calm water, refusing to end. Shaq's confession had done more than bridge a personal gap. It rippled through the building, touching everyone. Something profound had occurred. It wasn't just a moment between two basketball greats. It was a lesson in humility, in growth, in the courage it takes to admit you're wrong. Curry still held the mic. His hands trembled slightly, the emotion raw and visible. Shaq's vulnerability had opened a door, one that demanded honesty in return. "I have something to confess too," Curry said, his voice clear and reverberating through the silent arena. "Shaq, every word you ever said about modern basketball, I took it home with me." The crowd held its breath. The silence was no longer empty. It was reverent, charged with mutual respect. "When you said the game had lost its toughness, that players like me were ruining what made basketball beautiful. I stayed up at night, wondering if you were right." Shaq closed his eyes, the sting of regret unmistakable. Realizing that his words had haunted someone he secretly admired was almost too much to bear. "Because you have to understand," Curry continued, turning to face both Shaq and the crowd, "I grew up watching you dominate. For me, at 12 years old, weighing 99 pounds, you represented everything I thought I could never be. Brute strength, intimidating physical presence, the ability to change a game just by existing. A child in the front row, the same boy who had asked about long-distance shots, listened with total attention, his eyes moving between Curry and Shaq, as if he were watching a conversation between superheroes. At Davidson College, I played against guys who had 4,466 pounds more than me," Curry remembered, walking across the court while speaking. "Every night I would return to the dorm hurt, questioning if I really belonged in this world. And every night I would watch your highlights, trying to find some way to adapt your dominance to my body." The irony of the situation was palpable to everyone present. The man who had revolutionized basketball was revealing how he had been inspired exactly by the traditional era he supposedly was destroying. "Obviously, I never managed to imitate your physical strength," Curry said with a genuine smile, looking at Shaq. "But I learned something fundamental watching you. The importance of absolute confidence. You entered the court knowing you were unbeatable. That mentality, that unshakable certainty that I managed to adapt to my game." Shaq nodded, a new understanding being born in his eyes. Curry hadn't rejected the legacy of previous generations. He had studied, respected, and built upon it. "But do you know what was the most difficult moment of my career?" Curry asked, his voice gaining an emotional intensity that made the entire arena lean forward. "It wasn't losing the 2016 finals. It wasn't the injuries. It was hearing you say that players like me were destroying something you had helped build." The words hit Shaq like a physical blow. He had never considered that. His public criticisms could have such a profound impact on someone he himself secretly admired. Ahmad Rashad, who had conducted hundreds of interviews throughout his career, watched fascinated. In 3 decades covering sports, he had rarely witnessed such a moment of genuine mutual vulnerability between two superstars. "Do you know why this affected me so much?" Curry asked, now addressing especially the children present, "because I always knew I was underestimated. Too small for high school, too weak for college, too slow for the NBA. But when those criticisms came from someone I deeply respected, it hurt in a different way." He paused, looking at the arena ceiling for a moment, as if he were gathering strength for what would come next. After our first title in 2015, I went home and cried, Curry confessed, his voice breaking slightly. Not just from joy, but from relief. Relief for finally proving that a guy like me could win at the highest level. And do you know what my first thought was after the euphoria passed? The silence in the arena was so complete that you could hear the distant sound of Oakland traffic outside. Will Shaq respect me now? I had just won basketball's most important trophy, and all I wanted was validation from someone I had watched dominate when I was a child. The confession hit Shaq in a way he didn't expect. Realizing that Curry had spent his entire career seeking approval from the legends who came before him, including his own, was simultaneously touching and devastating. Man, Shaq said, unable to contain himself any longer. You had my respect long before I had the courage to admit it. The two men looked at each other for a moment that seemed suspended in time. Hundreds of people watched, but it was as if they were completely alone, two souls finally understanding each other after years of misunderstandings. Thank you, Curry said simply, extending his hand to Shaq. The handshake naturally transformed into another embrace, this one even more emotional than the previous one. The audience exploded in applause again, but this time there was something different. It wasn't just recognition for a special moment, but gratitude for being allowed to witness a genuine human transformation. Kenny Smith, who was in the stands, whispered to Charles Barkley, "Chuck, in 30 years in the NBA, I've never seen anything like this." Barkley, normally known for his humorous comments, was visibly emotional. This isn't about basketball, Kenny. This is about two men having the courage to be completely honest. While the applause continued, Shaq and Curry remained embraced at center court, both knowing they had lived something that transcended sport. They had discovered that mutual respect can flourish even after years of misunderstanding, and that true greatness sometimes lies in the ability to admit when we are wrong and to celebrate when others are right. The moment had transformed not only how they saw each other, but how the entire audience understood what personal growth, humility, and the courage necessary to evolve publicly means. The impact of that moment continued reverberating through Oracle Arena long after the applause had diminished. Ahmad Rashad, a seasoned host with years of experience under his belt, immediately sensed what everyone else already felt. There was no returning to the original program, not after what had just happened. Nothing could compete with the raw, emotional honesty they had just witnessed. Taking the microphone again, Ahmad looked out over the crowd and spoke with reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, regaining his composure, "I think we can all agree. We just witnessed something truly extraordinary. So, instead of going back to the schedule, how about we let Shaq and Steph keep talking?" The audience erupted in applause. The children seated up front sat wide-eyed and silent, as if watching their superheroes reveal something even greater than athletic talent, their humanity. Shaq took the mic once more, but this time his body language had shifted completely. The weight he had carried before was gone. In its place was something rare: peace, presence, and authenticity. He walked slowly toward the children, eyes gentle, voice calm. "You know," he began, "I spent most of my life trying to be the tough guy, the one who never showed weakness. I thought that was strength." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "But today, I learned something. Real strength is admitting when you're wrong and celebrating when someone else is right." From the second row, a young girl cautiously raised her hand. Shaq smiled and lowered himself down, his massive frame bending as far as his 7'1" body would allow. "Yes, princess?" The girl blinked, then asked in a small but clear voice, "Are you and Steph going to be friends now?" Her question, pure and unfiltered, sent a ripple of laughter through the crowd. Even Shaq and Curry chuckled, but the moment quickly turned serious again as Shaq looked her in the eyes. "You know what?" he said softly. "I hope we can be more than friends. I hope we can work together to teach other children like you that there are many different ways to be great." Curry approached, accepting the microphone. "Actually, I'm already thinking of some ideas. How about we create basketball clinics where we teach both the traditional physical game and modern innovations?" The impromptu proposal made Shaq's eyes light up. "Exactly. Show that there isn't just one right way to play. Teach that you can be great by being physically dominant like I was, or by being technically perfect like Steph, or by finding your own unique way." A war veteran in the third row, a man of about 45 years old wearing a Warriors t-shirt, asked permission to speak. Ahmad handed him an auxiliary microphone. "Gentlemen, as someone who served in Afghanistan, I can say that what you did here today, this is real leadership, showing that strong men can change their minds, can grow, can admit mistakes. This is the kind of example our children need." The comment deeply affected both Shaq and Curry. Both had always talked about being examples for youth, but had rarely considered how their ability to demonstrate personal growth could be equally inspiring. "Thank you for the observation," Curry responded, "and thank you for your service. One of the things that most impresses me about veterans is exactly this capacity for adaptation, for learning from difficult experiences and using those lessons to grow." Shaq nodded vigorously. "That's right. What you just said made me realize something in basketball. As in life, the biggest victories sometimes come after the biggest defeats or the biggest mistakes." The conversation now flowed naturally, without script, like a circle of friends sharing stories. Other veterans began to share their own experiences about adaptation and growth, creating an atmosphere of community that transcended basketball. 1 hour later, when the event officially came to an end, Shaq and Curry were the last to leave the court. They had spent individual time with practically all the children present, taking photos, listening to stories, and sharing advice. "You know," Shaq said while they walked toward the locker rooms, "this was one of the most important nights of my life. And look, I won 4 NBA titles." Curry laughed. "I was thinking the same thing. Titles are incredible. But this changes how you see yourself as a person." They stopped in the corridor where everything had begun a few hours before, the same place where Shaq had made the courageous decision to be completely honest. "Can I ask you something?" Curry said. "What made you decide to say all that publicly today?" Shaq reflected for a moment. "Honestly, it was seeing you talking with those children earlier. The way they looked at you, the naturalness with which you connected with them, made me realize I was wasting an opportunity to learn from someone who clearly had discovered something I was still trying to understand. And what was that? How to be great without making others feel small. How to inspire through inclusion instead of intimidation. How to use your talent to elevate others instead of just elevating yourself." The depth of Shaq's reflection impressed Curry. It was clear that the transformation of that night hadn't been superficial. It had touched fundamental convictions about leadership and legacy. Do you have any idea how this is going to change the way people talk about basketball? Curry asked. I hope so, Shaq responded. I hope that from today on, when someone talks about traditional basketball versus modern basketball, they remember that they're not enemies, they're different chapters of the same beautiful story. In the months that followed, the ETV partnership between Shaq and Curry would become one of the most inspiring collaborations in the sports world. They launched a basketball clinic program that visited underserved communities around the country, always emphasizing that there are multiple paths to greatness. More importantly, the video of that night in Oakland would become viral, not just among basketball fans, but among anyone interested in personal growth and reconciliation. Schools began using the moment as an example of how to apologize genuinely and accept differences with grace. But for Shaq and Curry, the most significant moment wasn't the public repercussions. It was the discovery that two people can see the same world from completely different perspectives and still find mutual respect and even friendship when they have the courage to be vulnerable. When they finally said goodbye that night in Oakland, both knew they had lived something that transcended basketball. They had learned that true greatness isn't in never being wrong, but in having the humility to admit when you are, and the wisdom to celebrate when others find better ways to do things. And perhaps most importantly, they had discovered that some of the deepest friendships can be born from the longest misunderstandings when two people finally have the courage to be completely honest with each other.